Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. While we're waiting for everyone to join the webinar, if you'd like to say hello in the chat box, let us know where you're joining us from. Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. It looks like we have Colorado, Oklahoma, Arizona, Missouri, New York, Virginia, Boston, New York. Oh, good mix of people here. That's great. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a couple seconds. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. Your phone line is muted. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and slides will be made available. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on mental health and youth development priorities for the summer and beyond. My name is Leslie Gabe-Swanston. I'm the Director of Program and Systems Quality at the National Summer Learning Association. Before we get started, here's a quick overview of our discussion today. First, I'll share a little bit about NSLA for those of you who are unfamiliar before we hear from our featured speakers. After that, we'll have some time for questions and answers from you, and then we'll wrap up with some follow-up announcements. As we're going along, if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them into the Q&A box. We'll try to catch them if they're in the chat box as well, but it's a little bit easier for us to see your questions if you put them in the Q&A box. So if you'd like them asked and answered live, please put them there. So a little bit about NSLA. The National Summer Learning Association is the only national nonprofit exclusively focused on addressing the achievement and opportunity gaps by increasing access to summer learning opportunities. NSLA's goal is to increase nationwide the number of high-quality summer learning programs. To achieve this goal, NSLA recognizes and disseminates what works, offers expertise and support for programs and communities, and advocates for summer learning as a solution for equity and excellence in education. NSLA's work is driven by the belief that all children and youth deserve high-quality summer learning experiences that will help them succeed in college, career, and life. Core to our work is the recognition that high-quality summer learning programs work and have been shown to improve reading and math skills, school attachment, motivation, and relationships with adults and peers. We know that summer is a time of great inequity for young people, and we believe that promoting and supporting summer opportunities is a way to address this. This goes beyond the summer learning that's in our name. We also want to see programs and communities addressing access to other resources like meals and youth employment. Summer is a time for innovation and exploration. Without some of the constraints of the school year, kids are able to try different ways of learning, interact with other adults and peers that they might not otherwise. It's also a time of innovation for adults, whether that is opportunities for professional development, trying out new teaching methods, or exploring new partnerships. So before we hear from our featured guest, I want to introduce Aaron Dorkin, CEO of NSLA. Aaron?
Oh, thank you, Leslie, and hello to everyone, and thank you so much to all our partners who've taken time out to join us today. Very excited to have Gil and Bailey from the PEAR Institute, national and international leaders and experts on youth development and mental health, and during this summer, which has been more challenging for all of us than ever, that we can remember these issues are more important than ever. And also the learning lessons from the summer programs people are providing right now to young people, and what lessons we can learn and support young people as they go into school in the fall, which is going to look very different as well. And I just want to underscore what Leslie said. We hope you all stay connected to us and join our NSLA community and let us support you and partner with you in many different ways. But as she said, I just want to underscore, summer is a time of great inequity. And we think it's one of the largest, most inequitable times in all of education. But it is also this wonderful time of opportunity if it's maximized and leveraged properly. And it's a time for us to improve and innovate and actually integrate and break down different silos across education. And finally, it's a real chance for us to have an impact, not just on individual lives of young people, but on families, communities, and actually on policy and across the country. So I think we're going to be learning a lot from today's call. And one thing that I want to make sure everyone is aware of is at the end of the call, we're going to be talking a survey opportunity that I think is really important for us to capture lessons learned and experiences from this current summer that we could learn from and improve upon and apply to the coming school year. But just want to thank you all again for joining us, and looking forward to hearing from Gil and Bailey. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. So now I'd like to introduce Gil Noam, founder and director of the PEAR Institute, an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and Bailey Brooker-Triggs, senior manager of communications and knowledge management at the PEAR Institute. Bailey and Gil.
Thank you.
Hold on one second. Thank you so much. Just trying to get organized here. Aaron, I really appreciate everything you said. Aaron and I go back many, many years when he was a student at Harvard, and a star student, as I might say, and he really took the idea of after school. This was the first course in a major university in after school at Harvard, and he took the course, and we stayed in touch, and look where he is now, not because of the course, but because of who he is. And Leslie, thank you so much for organizing this event. I know you do a lot of these, and I appreciate that we were invited. And NSLA in general, not just the two of you, has been an organization of really great strength and great commitment, and now of huge need. It has always been, I think, an organization that helped us create this field. And I was involved actually with it from the beginning, when it was still kind of located at the university. So let's start with a couple of the slides. And I think I'm going to go on mute for 1 second.
I'll just say hello as well. Bailey Triggs, work at the PEAR Institute with Dr. Noam. I'm the communications manager, and we're really excited to have this conversation with you today. And we're going to leave some time for discussion at the end. So please use the Q&A to ask questions as we're talking.
Yeah, I have behind the scenes here, you probably all have had technical fun issues. Siri is totally snooping around here and is kind of continuously, responding to anything I say. So I had to kind of get her out of my way. That's what I did. So anyway, we are going to actually now talk about the whole issue of mental health, all of this in 45 minutes. And by the time we're done, we will have solved all the problems that occur with this issue. Next slide. So, but on a more serious note, I mean, there are a lot of things that we actually know. And one thing we know for sure right now is that everything is uncertain. And everything is scary. And actually, when I made this slide, it was, or Bailey and I made the slide, it was, a while back. And, things were hard. But now we're in this kind of strange situation where things are, in many ways, even harder. And who would have thought that that's possible after a lockdown of so many months? That we opened up too fast. And now here we are kind of with the second wave. In some places it's the first wave. And really, even the question of schools opening is a huge question mark. And I think for you, I just want to really applaud all of you who are working in the summer space, that you have been so amazing to be able to live with that kind of ambiguity. Are we going to open? Is it going to be with the kids there? Are we going to be doing this online? Will the virtual environments really work? And how do we adapt? I mean, as adults, we have to adapt, and the young people have to adapt. And I think I would like to just start by saying, I don't think this is trauma by itself, because many people are saying this is traumatic. Go to the next slide. But I don't think we can just call it trauma, because not for everyone it was a trauma. It's adversity for everyone. And it is hardship for everyone, for sure. But to make it traumatic, it really requires something else, something additional than being away from the friends, having kind of isolation. All that is really super hard. But we'll get to the trauma side of things. And so I want to talk a little bit about the mental health side, but then also to the needs of all student and all staff and the role of flexibility. Next slide. So I think a very important lesson from our troubled times is that relationships matter. And summer and OST programs matter even more. So why am I saying this? I mean, it sounds really totally trivial, but it really, on a deeper level, it isn't trivial at all. I think that there is, in youth development, there is obviously a very big emphasis on relationships. But that's not true for schools and school districts in the same way. And that's why the integration of OST with school, or the kind of bridging, is so important, because teachers do have other agendas. They often have very good relationships with students, but the kind of primary issue of relationships is really something that now unifies us. And I think it gives summer and OST a bigger role right this moment. Why do I say that? I think that the only way, and I think there's a general recognition that opening schools in the fall is not going to happen well unless students feel they belong, unless we recognize what they had to go through. And unless we kind of really take the time to not just run and race towards catching up, but really taking the summer and what the students have in the summer into the school year, and really let the students and the staff reconnect. This is whether the schools are open physically or whether it's virtually. I think we all had a hard time dealing with the virtual environments. It was really tough on teachers and everyone. And we might be, left with that for quite some time, or at least some hybrid, and we have to prepare. Next slide. So among many of the concerns you raised, because you might remember that you were asked to kind of fill in some questions, and there were a lot of really good questions, and Bailey and I tried to synthesize them. One strand is this idea of the psychology and education of catching up. What does that really mean? How are we going to actually get the students back on track? That's a very important question, and I think we want to address that. The second one is the question of are the media correct? Are we in the middle of a mental health pandemic? Will it be a tsunami? Whatever the terms are being used, they're pretty dramatic. The second pandemic, but I thought the second pandemic was the economic problems and the loss of jobs, but then maybe the third pandemic is the mental health pandemic. But is it really a pandemic? What do we gain by calling it a pandemic? It just shows that there's anxiety. Then the questions that came up is the educator well-being. Can we just focus on the students, on the youth? And the answer is, of course, not. But we have to also at the same time recognize we're the educators, where you, the adults, are in this whole process. Everyone had adversity, including the adults. And then the last kind of set of questions, and there are many, many more, is the kind of uncertainty. If that becomes the norm, how do we plan for it? It's almost like a contradiction in terms. You know, if there's uncertainty, can you really plan? Yeah, you can, but it's really hard. Okay, so we'll get back to some of these questions, but I want to first really address the mental health side of things. So the question of, you know, what can we expect? So I want to remind you, many of you know this, but it's really pretty staggering. Every time I address this and really read it myself, under normal conditions, if you take out of the mix the pandemic, so you go back to January, 13 to 20% of children under the age of 18 have a mental disorder in any given year. So sit with that for a moment. 13 to 20%. That is, I mean, if we would be in a classroom, we could do this together. I would ask you, well, how many students are there in the United States? And you would tell me many different numbers, but the correct one, which you can all look up, is 56 million young people are in the United States right now, or in general, in school, so school age. So take, you know, let's say 20% of those, or anywhere between 13 to 20%. Most people take the number 16%. And you'll be around, you know, 10 million young people who need therapy or counseling or some extra support. It really means, when you think about your summer program, that in every group that consists of, you know, 25 students that you have, you know, you'll have 4 to 5 students who actually are sitting there with depression or anxiety disorder or a form of kind of aggression that they can't really control, et cetera, et cetera. Of those, under normal conditions, only 50% receive specialized mental health care, either in school or in out-of-school programs or wherever. So that's actually a huge progress, because 1999, when I started first looking at some of these numbers, there was a report by the Surgeon General. The numbers were more like 20%. So we've made huge gains, but it does mean that 50% of students really are not receiving mental health care. Okay, next slide. So now, you know, we charged ourselves as a center, PEAR, as an institute located within a university and affiliated with a teaching hospital, McLean. We thought we really should figure out from other studies what the connection is. And Elaine Tsao and a few research interns helped with this work and really went through the whole literature together with me and Bailey and others. And what we found was that the review of all the studies of economic crises, other pandemics like the Spanish flu, natural disasters, wars, what you get, and unfortunately there's much too much to work from because there's so many terrible things that have happened, but even like the Great Recession all the way back to the Great Depression, what we said is we predict an increase from 13 to 20% to 25 to 30% of all young people will have, you know, reached psychiatric levels of problems. Don't have to be long-term, but they will have reached that. So the reason why this is important for you to think about in these terms is that there are many, many more students who will have been affected by what's happening. I mean, having been at home for a long time, they will be affected, but they are not necessarily going to show psychiatric symptoms, but they will show, psychological ups and downs. And in many ways, and this is the example here of Katrina, when children were studied, after Katrina, 37% of the children that were exposed received a mental health diagnosis. So that's actually more than the 30% that we anticipate. And I can, in the discussion, go into why I'm more conservative. I prefer staying conservative. And they were 5 times more likely to experience serious emotional disturbance than a pre-Katrina cohort. This also is important. The effects lasted years after Katrina actually happened. I mean, in general, it also went down. I mean, not everyone stayed at this level, but there were a subgroup that actually still showed symptoms 2, 3, and 4 years later. Next slide. So we know a few things right now, and then I will stop depressing you, but I do think we need to kind of level set at a certain place here. We have a few studies about COVID right now and child well-being. A parent survey found that 3 in 10 K through 12 students are showing early signs of emotional and mental health issues right now. This was actually done very recently. So again, you get the kind of 30% range, 25 to 30%, even like in that description. Monthly child abuse reports to the National Sexual Assault Hotline from children under 18 increased by 22% in March 2020. And that is actually, it's not surprising. It's scary, but it's not surprising, because if you have people who are already vulnerable and now they're going to be extra vulnerable, they lost their jobs, they start drinking more, and before you know it, you have really abuse and not only sexual abuse, but all kinds of abuse. And then 45% of adults in the US report in another study that their mental health has been negatively affected by the pandemic. I mean, it's important to recognize in all of this that there is also resiliency. And there are people who are saying, including teachers who we surveyed, that actually this time hasn't been so bad. And they've been able to do things that they haven't been able to do before. And, especially more introverted people who are not as much in need of relationships and are fine with just having, being able to read and being able to think, and then having to connect to other people, but not in the same amount that extroverted people are needing these kinds of relationships. So it's not everyone, but 45% have really reported as having problems. And those are, of course, many of those are parents. And so if the parents are struggling, you can imagine how the kids are struggling. Okay, next. So I want to pivot here. I mean, if we would be in the same room, I would say, okay, let me stop here. Let me find out some questions. What do you think? And let's take a breather, since we aren't like in the same room, before I kind of jump into the next topic. But I just want you to take this in for just a moment. And I would love to hear from you, and you can put it in the chat. Are these numbers surprising? Are they, you can see, I'm not arguing that it's a tsunami, but I'm arguing that, 30% of a whole population, that means for every child that you have, for every 3 children that you have in your program, 1 child will have significantly suffered, and to the point where they have kind of, something has broken down in them. They can still function, they can still come. These diagnoses don't mean that people still can have fun and can be there and so on, but it will be like a split screen. They can be with you, you can, mentor them, you can support them, but they're going to have an internal movie going on as well. about fear, about trauma, about what just happened, about, you know, terrible separation anxiety, worry about parents who had to work during this time. I mean, I hope that these numbers really create empathy and create a sense of, not a sense of despair, because this doesn't mean that every one of these children needs to be in therapy or needs to be in a psychiatric setting. I mean, far from it. But it does mean that we have to now create environments that are extra supportive. And, you know, when you think about what is the curative element of treatment, it usually is the human relationship and the human bond, which you can actually, in your programs and also in the transition to the schools in the fall, that you can provide outside the family. And we'll get back to that issue. So here's kind of our model that we use in order to understand young people. It's called the Clover model. And the reason why I want to mention it is that there are 4 elements that we have distilled. And there are also SEL elements, ways in which to understand the socio-emotional side of human beings, and especially youth, but it also applies to adults. And what I want to suggest to you is that, you know, as much as I've just talked to you about diagnoses and numbers and so on, I really don't fully believe in them. I really believe that what really matters is a positive youth development approach to human beings. So not like, let's figure out what the problems are, let's diagnose them and let's help, which is very important. But I think more important is to first figure out, what is our North Star? What is it that we can define as health and well-being as a first step? And that's where we took, from my perspective, a pretty audacious step by saying, yeah, you can say what it is. We know, we have enough research now to say that if you have 4 elements coming together, if you can go to not to the next slide, but bring them together, Bailey, you will see that we don't think about these as just entities, but it's kind of Venn diagram. So what you have is a young person in a body, embodied, active, and a sense of movement. You have a young person with voice who can actually say, I stand for something. I want to be heard. I don't want to be told that I'm just a troublemaker. I want to actually have productive ways in which I can express myself, assertiveness. I want to have relationships. I want to be in a setting where people really love me, take care of me, get me, they care for me. And I want to do the same thing. I want to be with peers. I want to be with other people. It's really critical. And finally, reflection, which I want to translate here today into meaning. I have meaning. I have identity. I have a sense of purpose. I really understand why I'm around, and I have a sense of future. When you have those elements, sure, you can add lots of other ones, creativity and spirituality, and all the kinds of things. But we wanted to have the minimal amount, and the minimal is for us, like the basic colors. I actually wanted to get to 3, but I couldn't. It ended up 4. And once you have that, then you can go back and really figure out in your own settings, are you allowing for these 4 things enough? What is the balance between them? Because one thing is clear, you need it. And we do have research evidence for that. You need those elements in order for young people to thrive. Next slide. So again, if we would be in the same room, I would ask you to actually apply these 4 principles yourselves to both your experience of the pandemic, but also to what you see in young people as an educator. Because you can actually track, and I wasn't sure that was going to happen, but I think you can track a lot of the issues of the negative issues and even the mental health issues along the Clover lines. So what were the deprivations that young people and their parents and their educators really experienced? Well, lack of physical activity at home, no sports teams, no summer in the way that we usually have the summer. So all the things that we take for granted, all the stuff that makes our memories of childhood are really constrained. Second, loss of voice. You know, if you don't have your peers around and you don't have your teachers who you can actually tease and have a little fight with and all those kind of wonderful things that drive us adults crazy, if we take them positively, like the way of being at home did not provide young people the voice that they needed. And I think the reason why the virtual environment did not work for many teachers and many schools was that we didn't figure out enough, we didn't have enough time to figure out how to bring in voice, student voice, into the process, online, virtually. Relationships, you know, well, I don't have to talk about this too much. I mean, if kids were lucky, they were with great parents and families and siblings and all that, and they were lucky and they had just imagine we wouldn't have Zoom or wouldn't have had all the technology so kids could communicate. It isn't the same. And I know that because I see kids in therapy also. I can't describe to you how much they were suffering from not being with their peers and not being, especially adolescents, but really also younger children, how much they needed it, how much they even needed to be with their teachers and other mentors, youth workers outside the home, how deprivation, how depriving that was. And finally, on the reflection side, the deprivation was one of meaning, which is very serious, especially as it relates to suicide, you know, long-term, because people who don't have meaning long-term are often the ones who really don't want to live anymore. So the idea of, you know, anxiety, what's the world going to be like? Everything is falling apart. All the adults I look at are fighting with each other, whether they're red or blue. They don't have the same thing. One mom to mask, next mom no mask. I mean, it just is so confusing for everyone, but especially for children who need to feel secure in a sense of where we are, how we're going to get through this, and what the future is going to be. And with every day, we just continue with this confusion. We actually rob the children and the students of a sense of hope in their future. Next. So I just want to, you know, apply this to your summer programs. So you can see what I'm not doing here is to say, hey, you got to now have a clinician on board and that clinician has to see every third child. That's not, I don't think from a youth development perspective that is realistic. I think you need to give that information to the schools. So when the children come to school, the schools have to be ready to figure out, you know, the schools have to really figure out how they're going to plan for young people who need therapy. So it's not just the 50%, or even if we continue with the 50%, that's 50% of 30%, that's a lot of kids. So, you know, every school district should sit there right now, and we can help with the planning actually, should think through what are we going to do with those students? Who are our community partners? How can we do this? But I think a lot of it is not only traditional therapy or medication or any of that. A lot can be done by putting into the base, like what we often call tier 1, the right ingredients into the water, so to speak, the ingredients of relationships, positive, productive relationship. Here you can see the outlet for the body, recess, nutrition. Got to really focus on that when the kids come back, because they have actually not had much of that. Nutrition maybe, but they really haven't had a lot of resource outlet for the body, and that's going to be super important, even online, if you do it online. Second, they got to have voice, and I think what this means is that we have to, and I hope you do this also within your programs, your summer programs, give young people as much possibility for leadership, for identity expression, for perseverance, for trying and failing and trying, and especially for voice, norm setting. Let's set some norms. Let's really figure out what's okay and what isn't okay. You can't get, no teacher could get the kid who didn't want to come out of bed. We know that. I mean, they tried and nothing really worked. What works is engagement. If you don't come, you're going to miss out on something. We're going to do something and we want to hear from you. That's, I think, the stance we have to take. And again, I'm not preaching, probably preaching to the choir here because, you all probably do that and agree with it. But you will be amazed with how hard it is for many educational settings to kind of really focus on that. Strong relationships, we already talked about this. I think it's really critical to spend the time in the beginning, icebreakers, anything you can do to kind of give the sense of belonging. And this is a much longer discussion than we have right now. And then encourage awareness, self-awareness, and meaning and relevance. All the activities now have to be even more relevant than they were before. They have to be related to the times, related to the basic fundamental questions students have about why is it worth doing all the things we're doing when the world is kind of so shaky. So we are the adults and we have to bring meaning into their lives and also hope. Okay, next slide. So I just want to, end with a few more ideas that I think might be helpful, and then I want to hand it over to Bailey. I think that it's not only the individual clover leaves that we're thinking about. And by the way, I'm perfectly fine if you say, I want to use clover, but I want to also add 2 or 3 more elements to it. I mean, you have also other frameworks like the Castle framework and others. I think what we wanted to do, what was really important to me, is to start with the individual person and his or her experience, whether adult or student, because you can apply this to yourself, not just to the kids, and say, well, what's my clover? What is my today? How much active engagement do I have? What's my sleep pattern? How am I actually, dealing with my impulse control? How much voice, how many decisions did I make today? How much do I procrastinate? How much do I actually am willing to actually put pen to paper and speak out? How much do I spend in relationships and how much do I care for others? And I think many people are saying that the pandemic had the paradoxical effect of actually creating more time and more care in relationships and for relationships, even at a long distance. And how much time did I spend today just, journaling or really thinking or breathing or meditation? I mean, those are the elements of a psychological balance. And I really have come to believe that they're as important as the nutrition pyramid. That really what we have to do is take this as seriously as we do when we think about and, feed our children. Are we balancing things out? And, it's very hard to balance things out under these conditions, but we have to do it next. So this led me to a question, which I want to share with you. And again, would have loved to, talk to you in person. Like with all this uncertainty, what really can we prepare young people for? We can't just pretend and do whatever we did before, because everyone says there's going to be a new normal. And I believe that everything has changed in the last few months. I mean, it's already was in the process of changing, but it's changed more. So people are not going to go back to work in the same way that they did before. Not everyone will show up in their office. That's a transformation that was in the making, but it's here now. Telemedicine, I mean, trekking around and spending, $30 for some kind of parking garage in order to see a doctor. Yeah, you'll do it if it's we really need to, but most of it will be done in telemedicine. And therapists never thought that you could do therapy over Zoom. Hey, now everyone's pretty happy and feels like it can be done. So a lot of it is adaptational. So I feel that actually flexibility is what we need to teach students and is what we as adults have to learn. We have to start thinking about, we're not just trying to get you to college. We're trying to get you to a place where you actually will be a flexible person who can adapt. This is not the last crisis. And in fact, we're now going to be in a new normal that will take a long time to settle. And during that time, I assure you, student, you're not going to have one career in your life. You're most likely going to have 4 or 5. That's already happened. And we will have to help you get to the point of flexibility. And it's interesting that in all the SEL things that, skills that we talk about, that, for example, self-management and teamwork and all of that, flexibility has not found its way into the general canon. And I believe it is important. So here are a couple of, and the reason why I show you this blog, because you, with more time, can read it. It really took off in a very surprising way. I wrote it very, with the input of also Bailey and Elaine. I wrote it at a time when everyone was just kind of coming to the lockdown, into the lockdown situation, and was arguing that we can make something out of this time. Not just, it's not because everyone was writing about loss and anxiety. And I thought that, training ourselves to be more flexible would be a good thing. And it really took off. There were so many people that were just really interested in this idea. And it was very gratifying that it helped people. So I'm just looking at time, so I really have to end here. What I'm trying to show you is that we as school districts and youth organizations have always been interested in young people's flexibility, but we haven't done enough. And this is the moment where I believe that you, as you still are running your summer programs and as you're planning for the school year, that the idea of reducing a lot of mental health problems are problems of rigidity. You want something to be in a way that it isn't. And usually the clinical process is to make you a little more flexible, a little more open, a little more going with the anxieties to the point that it doesn't become anxiety attacks, and same with depression, etc. So I believe that flexibility and resiliency are the way that we can deal with a public health problem. And here I wrote down a few things that are kind of connected, routines of relaxation, failing often and trying new things, listening, not lecturing, as we as adults, really continuously being playful and creative with ourselves, with our mates, with our partners, with our children, and in our programs. Challenging previously held beliefs. Just because you believe it doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, this is something that the whole country needs. And ask lots of why questions. Why do you think about this? How do you think about this? These are just small examples, but I think if you just remember that one of the goals and one of the ways in which education, youth development, and summer learning and mental health come together is if we have some bridging constructs such as flexibility, where we say we really need to work on this wherever the children are, because we can't promise them a really clear future. We can't promise that to ourselves. What we can promise them is to equip the students with the abilities where they can actually thrive, where they can find balance despite the adversity. And that's, I think, the best medicine against the kind of half tsunami, I don't feel it's a full tsunami, of mental health problems that we're going to address. And everyone's going to try to address them through mental health counselors and medication and all that stuff, which is good and important, but we got to have something kind of upstream, and now is the time to go upstream. So thank you. So I think that this is something that Bailey can actually, it's a good transition, Bailey. You can.
Sure, yeah, definitely. So in that spirit, I will also, we can put in the chat a link. We have a dedicated place on our website where we've been hosting webinars, especially about the issues of virtual spaces, how to work with SED when you can't be face-to-face anymore, and then also focusing on academic motivation. So these are two webinars that we're highlighting here that are on this resource page. And then we're also developing a series of workshops focusing on returning to learning, what that's going to look like in the fall, focused around belonging, relationships and structure, understanding mental health, and also how to engage students in virtual learning. So those resources will be on our website as sort of a follow-up to what Gil was talking about. And then I can talk a little bit about the holistic student assessment. So this is getting into, Erin mentioned there was an opportunity to work with us on a project to help better understand the socio-emotional needs of the youth that you're working with. So at PEAR, we've developed the holistic student assessment. It's a student self-report, takes about 15 to 20 minutes to administer. It's all online through the Qualtrics platform, so it can be done virtually. You don't need to do it in person, and we have some protocols around what that takes to do that. The general HSA is aligned with the Clover model, and I can show you quickly what that looks like, and works for grades 3 through 12. And what we do with this is we really think of it as living data. It's not just evaluation data for the end of the year, although we do that as well with a retrospective version of this, but really information that you can get right away so that you can be making decisions about youth socio-emotional needs. We have many versions of this. We have teacher perspective versions, family perspective versions, and retrospective versions. So in a minute, I'll talk a little bit more about the retrospective version that we're piloting, that we're hoping we can get a cohort together of summer programs interested in trying it out with us to see what youth are saying specifically about how they're doing in this moment and their socio-emotional needs. So this image here is giving you a sample of some of the questions that we ask. I like to learn new things. I stand up for things that matter to me. And you'll see from this slide, this is where this aligns with the Clover model. So we have these 8 domains here that are really connected to Clover. On the HSA, it's action orientation, emotion control, assertiveness, perseverance, trust and empathy, which align with belonging, and reflection and optimism. We also ask questions about learning and school engagement. And in the case of this pilot test, we're also going to be asking about specific at-home experiences with the pandemic, how youth are doing. So I just want to give you a very brief demo. Since we collect this data in Qualtrics, we also do the visualization there. So part of the participation in this project would be to be able to look at your data online. I'm just going to switch over. So this is an example. This is what, it's a demo dashboard. So with fake student data of the holistic student assessment. We do have it drilled down to multiple levels. So this is an aggregate view of a whole program or whole school. You can also look at a youth individual responses, and you can also look at youth in groups, which is what the heat map is. In the interest of time, so we make sure we get to your questions, I'll just show you briefly how this summary page works. We calculate based on youth response, their average strengths and challenges. And so that's taken by taking a student's response and then norming it based on their age band and gender. And we've collected thousands of cases over the years. And so we have a specific norming data set that we're using so that you can see whether the youth you're working with are above or below the norm for their age group. If they're reporting above the norm, then we call that a strength. And if they're reporting below the norm, we call that a challenge. This is an asset-based assessment, so we really encourage people to focus on the strengths that youth are reporting first and use that as leverage to help address some of the challenges. So in this example, you'll see in this cohort, we have about 500 youth who have participated, and their top strength is learning interest, with empathy being a close second. And then the top challenge is perseverance, with academic motivation being another challenge. And the thing that's nice about this platform and visualization is you can actually start drilling down to make certain comparisons. So if you wanted, for example, to see how boys differed in response, you'll see we had 692 boys that took the survey. You'll see their tiers. So this is a combination of strengths and challenges. This is how we calculate. If you have mostly challenges, you're a tier 3. A mixture of strengths and challenges is a tier 2. And mostly strengths is a tier 1. And you'll see with this cohort of boys, their top strength is learning interest and relationships with peers. So that's a really valuable strength to have when you're thinking about how to connect students to really engage them, that they have these strong relationships. But academic motivation is a big challenge, as well as critical thinking. And academic motivation is really about the desire to do well in an academic setting. So these boys are saying they have strong learning interests, they care about learning, and they have that as a strength. But for whatever reason, they're not really connecting that to the academic experience or feeling like they want to do well. So that's immediately an area to consider supporting youth. And then if you switch that over to girls, you'll see a different picture. And where you look at this cohort, perseverance for girls is actually the top challenge, as well as action orientation, which is all about moving the body. So these girls are reporting that they don't like to move their body, they don't like to feel physical, especially when we're thinking of the impact, as Gil was saying before, of the pandemic and how that's really making it harder for youth to get outside and exercise. If you're seeing higher levels of students reporting challenges in action orientation, that could be an indication that we really should focus on how to get students more engaged in the physical. I'm gonna switch back this just to get a little bit more specific about the pilot we're proposing. And we're also gonna put this form in the chat. So the idea for this is a retrospective pre-post version of the holistic student assessment. So we would be using 12 items from the main holistic student assessment. We'd also have 2 site-related questions, and we'll have 5 mental health related questions, and then 6 at-home experience fill-in questions. So those will be text boxes just to really capture the youth experience. And so in this version of the HSA, we'll ask students to rate how they felt before they were in your summer program and how they feel now. So it would be administered at the end of the program to have youth really say how they've been doing before they came and after. So we can really look at some of the impact, and we can also see from some of those open-ended questions, places where youth might have social emotional needs that are going to carry over into the school year. So Gil, I don't know if you want to chime in a little bit about this study or any other thoughts you have.
Well, just I do want to suggest that anyone who is interested should we should set up a separate time so we don't take everyone's time on this. But just so you understand, because this might sound like a research project and just using your kids or you for a research study. That's not what we have in mind here. What we've actually discussed for a long time with Aaron and also with this, even with the predecessors, is to really figure out how we can build in measurement so it doesn't really overwhelm students. So it's really something that takes 15 minutes or 20 minutes at some point. Some of you do this anyway. And for us to begin to have an understanding similar to what we have for schools and our other after-school providers, and some of you in large youth organizations also do some of this, but some of for NSLA to have some good data, knowledge of what actually is happening with a population, with a group, and how can one actually then use that in order to get funding, in order to make the case that certain things have to happen. That's number one. Number two is that we want to do it in a way that you as a program actually get the data. And we want to do this because the times are so hard for everyone. We're going to do this phase, this year for free. So it's not going to be a cost for you, because we believe that that we need to know better, and that you need to, if we really are serious about the issues that I've been talking about earlier, that we need to give data. We need to have people have data. And I think also as a field as a whole, all of us want to help build the field. It's important to recognize now, where were we when, looking back in 3 years, let's say, where were we when the pandemic hit, and what did the students tell us, the self-report as student voice, and how did we do over time? So we're interested, actually, if this works out well, to consider doing this over time, but at this point, it's just an invitation to a one-time, and I know that there's a lot of interest in general. We've already received interest, but we want to really be inclusive in the invitations. Okay.
Great. So I think we have a little time now for questions. I know I've been seeing the Q&A lighting up. Leslie, if you want to select some for us.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you, Gil, and thank you, Bailey. So we do have some time for a couple of questions. The first one, Gil, someone wants you to expand on why you prefer to be conservative with your expectations of children who will experience mental health issues. I think you mentioned it.
It's a great question, and I'll try to keep. It's not easy for me to answer questions very short, in a very short way, but I will do it because we want to get through a number of them. So this is actually an easy one. I want to be conservative because, first of all, I always cringe a little bit when the media, makes it a hey, this is the next pandemic. I think we should be very data oriented and rational about it. I actually think that 30%, we're talking about disorders here. We're not talking about pain. We're not talking about people coming back with problems. We're talking about someone who reaches criteria, really research criteria for depression, anxiety disorder, etc. The main reason why I want to be a little conservative, I want people to wake up and to realize this is going to be big, but I don't want them to feel like, well, we can't do anything about it anyway. And to just give you an example of that, I hear a lot in school districts where people saying, oh, we shouldn't really let's not call it mental health. That actually is a bad word. Let's just call it SEL, because that's asset. So what's happening there is that people are trying to redefine the need for services for young people because they know that they won't have enough services. And the next sentence that someone actually did tell me just a short while ago, a high administrator in one of the school districts, say, well, we'll have 80% of students who will need psychiatric support because we just went through a trauma. And I want to be able to say, no, you don't need 80%. It's not going to be 80% because a lot you can do differently. But for that 30%, let's start now to figure out how to actually provide services. We can even go down to how many kids will have anxiety disorder, how many kids will have drug and alcohol abuse issues, and we can really start planning this moment. That's why I want to be realistic and not, make it so big that people get hopeless.
So we have another question. For schools or students that need to remain in a virtual education setting, what are your suggestions to meet the students' social and emotional needs within the limitations of the virtual connection? Also, how can mental health professionals provide broad sweeping support to school staff and students?
Great questions. Are these two different people or one person?
It's one person.
One person. Wow. Well, on the virtual side, let me just say that we are newbies, all of us, with some exceptions of people who really work super hard and super fast and have really good ideas. We need to find, and NSLA can do this with our help and others. We really have to have a resource library, examples of where it happens really well. SEL can be done anywhere. And that's where Bailey's reference to some of the webinars on our site are important. We will have a training program, like 3 different workshops, just on this question of how do you actually create SEL environments, relational environments, virtually. And that's really super important. And I think I can't go into the details, but I can just tell you that we and others in the field are really making progress. And it can be done. And if I can just mention, and maybe you can send it on, we will have a webinar with Weikert, the YPQA, and NIOST on this issue of what are quality relationships virtually? Can we learn from our observations? So that's going to be important. In terms of mental health in the schools, I am a great fan of this 3-tier idea. The mental health professional shouldn't just sit there in the basement of a school waiting for one kid after another, because that person will be filled up in October. So I think what we need to do is that the mental health professional needs to work with teachers. We need to be very aware of the stresses on the adults. So the mental health professionals should also really be supportive of the environment and should help create a school climate that is inclusive, loving, if I may use that word, recognizing the stresses people have felt, and especially the students coming back. And that will go a long way. It's a different way of just having the mental health professional deal with the tier 3 biggest problems.
Thank you. So I want to recognize that we're at the hour. Do you have a couple minutes to answer another question, or?
Yeah, I do. I definitely, yeah, Bailey too. Yeah, we definitely have that.
So for those of you who can stick around a little bit longer, we're going to answer a few more questions that will be captured in the recording if you are not able to stay with us.
But just before you do that, can we have some mechanism where people can sign up for more information about what we are offering as a way of assessment?
Mm-hmm, yes, so I put the link to sign up for the assessment in the chat box, and
right.
that will also be shared when we send out the link to the recording,
right.
so people will get access to that. So we have a question about, can you speak to the anxieties of young people concerning relatives and acquaintances lost to COVID, as well as the anxiety of anticipation about becoming ill?
Sure. Bailey, anytime you want to jump in, please do.
Sure. I'm also answering in the chat a couple things.
Okay. Oh, good. Thank you. Thanks for doing that. I can't do that all at once. I mean, one way of addressing is just like every day when I read the newspapers that I read, I just like have to almost like pinch myself to say this can't be true. Tell me this can't be true. I mean, because behind the statistics of 10,000 people having gotten the infected in one day in one state, behind that are real people, and not only the people but the loved ones, and the worries and concerns. And I think we have to treat this differently in the question. If you lose someone, the focus has to be on mourning. That's really mourning under the worst conditions, almost worst conditions, because you can't be at the funerals. Oftentimes you can't be there when the loved one dies. I mean, they're just horrific situations, one after the other. And there, I think we just have to provide community support. We have to provide little things like, food for the family, and just reaching out, and condolence cards, and calling not just once, but over time, to really make the person feel less alone during the time of mourning. If it's really about like all these things are happening and I'm super scared, which is very typical in young people and also older people, I think there, we have techniques to deal with anxiety. And part of it is really having the information. But the problem is that even if you inform and say, if you do these things, you're not going to get the virus. I mean, most likely. And also for a young person to kind of say, even if you get it, it is most likely not going to be dangerous to you. So, I mean, creating reality helps, but there is a level of anxiety that is really psychological anxiety that is not totally rational, and that you have to treat, if it really gets bad, with cognitive behavior therapy. That's the treatment of choice. When a person really becomes so overwhelmed by anxiety that, then you have to do extinction type therapy, which is like, really, let's talk about it, let's really think about it, and it gets closer and closer to what you're most afraid of, and slowly the anxiety will kind of dissipate, at least to a great extent.
We have a question about how to introduce playfulness to students in a serious time while still taking them seriously. This person says, I've seen how much relief play, even if it's wordplay and humor, brings to students.
Absolutely. I think that I'm glad that it's not just a question, but an affirmation. Just a little study from the London Blitz in the Second World War. Anna Freud and also John Bowlby, some of the kind of eminent psychologists of the last century, really studied kids who were with their parents during the bombardment and kids who were taken kind of to the countryside to be actually more protected, who did better, because the kids in the city had to go down to the basements of the buildings and were continuously in fear that they would be killed by the bombs. But the important thing was that the kids who were attached to their parents or really good caretakers in the countryside, that was the factor that was more important than the physical safety for the long-term mental health for the children. So the idea so that's attachment. But attachment also means playfulness, being close, feeling secure. So when we're talking about playfulness, we are talking about adults allowing the young person kind of enveloping with a sense of security that then becomes also a play space. And the play space is a way in which kids can actually get distracted and can actually humor, and really kids live in the moment. And also it's true for adolescents. I mean, they just get away from the hardship of the moment, and a lot of it is relationship. But in the relationship, what happens in the relationship, if the parent or the adult isn't too stressed, and that's where the summer comes in, that you actually, by providing rituals and by providing a sense of connection and security, you actually are much more mental health providers than you realize. You are youth development workers with a mental health focus without ever having to use that term, because the space you're creating is curative. It is actually a place where a young person can feel like whole again and can be distracted from the anxiety and from the hardship of our times.
I have another question. How do we account for or respond differently at this moment to students in a perpetual state of a poverty pandemic and now a COVID pandemic? And how do we address the mental health stigma held by many families of color and shift to a more of a wellness mindset?
Well, that's also a great question, a great proposal. And I think we have to work on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. I think we have to reduce the mental health stigma, because mental health comes with money. Kind of wellness doesn't come with money. So there's no insurance company that, I mean, they give a little money here for a gym, to go to the gym, but very little. I mean, the real money is you have a problem, you get paid by the insurance to solve the problem. So we got to work on that, because we don't want to walk away. We don't want people to walk away from those resources of getting really good mental health support that should be equitable to physical support. So because someone might fear, surgery, we wouldn't say, hey, forget about that, don't go to a surgeon. I mean, if they have a real thing that might need surgery, we would want that person to see a specialist. So I think we have to work on that. But there is also a way in which mental health categories are used as a weapon to pathologize issues and populations. And I think that's a huge issue. And I think that's why I have chosen, and Bailey and I and all of us have chosen a wellness model. Clover does not start from a diagnosis. It starts from what are the ingredients of strength? And voice is a very important one. So when I see young people now having a strong voice about racism, you can call that like a cleansing of society that is hugely important. And that is part of what we have to go. We have to create, you know, ways in which young people are not isolated, but really have each other and each other's ideas and ideologies and fight for equity, which is as important as wellness and as mental health. It's like almost like a third thing. It's where there's wellness, there's really a sense of justice and a fight for justice, and there's mental health, and they're probably interwoven, that the more you really have purpose in a way that you believe you're fighting for a just cause and it's something that has to happen, you're going to most likely also have more wellness, especially if you still sleep and eat during that time. And you're probably going to have less mental health issues because you're going to be focused on what you think the world should look like.
So we have one last question. How do relationships fit into the Clover?
Well, maybe Bailey, what do you think?
Belonging in everything. I mean, I think about the HSA, what we measure, we have so much focus on relationships because that's so key. So it's not only your empathy and your trust, but we also look at your peer relationships and your adult relationships. And when we think about returning to school, that sense of belonging is the first thing that we're really talking about, you know, whether it's virtual, in person, a hybrid, whatever we're doing, everything starts with that relationship connection. So I think it connects to that belonging domain for sure, but is something that throughout the entire Clover is really essential and the first step to socio-emotional development.
Great, thank you so much. So those were all the questions that we have. So thank you so much, Gil and Bailey. I'm just going to wrap up a couple of announcements, last minute things. So thank you for everybody for joining us today. This is part of our Voices of Summer webinar series. If you haven't joined us for some of our past webinars, you can see some links to past webinars on our website on the webinars page. Look out for some of the upcoming topics. We will be having some topics for nonprofits around preventing staff burnout and fundraising during COVID-19. And then another one that we're partnering with Scholastic on around learning and teaching anti-racism in expanded learning programs. So look out for announcements about those. The best way to hear those announcements is to follow us on social media. So make sure you are following us on Twitter or Facebook, or sign up for our newsletter on our website, and join our community where you can join groups of special cohorts of peers interested in topics like sports or literacy or youth employment. You can also find out more about our consultation support and technical assistance for your summer program. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to all of you for sticking around a little bit longer, and we will be in touch. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Yeah.